This is the correct version of the PowerPoint presentation that I gave in class on Wednesday, April the 12th. It has a few extra bits that are not included in the version that I gave in class. So please use this in order to get a complete understanding or a fuller understanding, and please use it also to help you to fill out the prints that I gave you in class. Okay, so I'm starting with the Wars of the Roses, which have their origin in the 14th century, and things go back really to this man, Edward III, who was a very powerful 14th century English king. Very powerful and probably not very pleasant, probably a rather nasty character from some of the things we know about him. But powerful he certainly was, and under his leadership during the 50 years, a large part of the 14th century, England became one of the most powerful countries in Europe. And these Wars of the Roses, as we call them, were fought between two branches of his family after his death. You have John of Gaunt and Edmund of York. John of Gaunt being the founder of the House of Lancaster, as it was called, and Edward founding the House of York. And these two families were fighting for control of the country. Well, Henry Tudor was actually from the House of Lancaster. He's the first king that we're interested in for our period. He was the king at the beginning of the 16th century. Now, how did he come into power? Basically, he led an army against the unpopular Yorkist king, Richard III. And then he married the Yorkist king's niece, uniting the two families, and in this way he became the king. Okay, so this is Richard riding off into battle and falling off his horse, and he was killed, and leading to the famous line that we get in Shakespeare, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. And then, as I say, Henry married Richard's niece. I don't suppose the conversation was exactly like this, but it was this sort of situation. So Henry killed her uncle, and he was an unpopular man. She seems not to have been too bothered about it, and she married the man who he hadn't directly killed her uncle, of course, but he'd led the army against her uncle, and by getting married, they then united the two families of Lancaster and York, and the Wars of the Roses came to an end. Now, Richard is often seen through the eyes of Shakespeare, who wrote a play about him, and not just Shakespeare, but a sort of image of Richard grows up from several sources, seeing him as a hunchback, a man who ordered the murder of his own two nephews, and basically a pretty nasty character. There's a lot of debate about whether that's true, and whether he really had his two nephews put to death, but that's the picture that we get of him in Shakespeare. His remains were actually dug up a few years ago in Leicester, and they do show, as this portrait also shows, that he would have had a slight kind of hump on his right shoulder. His shoulder would have been lifted up unnaturally. So he didn't exactly have a hunched back. He had a raised shoulder as a result of some kind of deformity of his spine. So, on to Henry VII then, and Firstly, by marrying Elizabeth, he united the two houses, putting an end to the Wars of the Roses, and the dynasty that had ruled England was called the Plantagenets. That dynasty came to an end, and the Tudor period begins. It's also the end of the Middle Ages, really, or the Middle Ages is sometimes considered to have ended a little bit before Henry VII, but roughly around that time, the Middle Ages came to an end. The usual kind of measuring of the Middle Ages is the period from the end of the Roman Empire in the 5th century up to the Renaissance in the 15th century. And it was during the century after the Romans left Britain that the people we know as the English arrived in Britain. So the medieval period is also coincides in England's case with the beginning of the medieval period coincides with the arrival of the so-called English people, the Anglo-Saxon people. And before that, under Roman Britain and before Roman Britain, the country had been occupied by the Celtic people. So just taking a look at that, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, after the Romans left, the British Isles were divided into 3 basic areas, and they were all occupied by Celtic peoples of one kind or another. There were the Picts in the north, the Gaels in Ireland and in part of Scotland, and the Britons in what we now mostly see as England and Wales. And the Romans constructed a sort of infrastructure of roads, and they built a wall, that red line across there, dividing what is now roughly Scotland from England. And so the Britons were basically in that southern area, with the Picts in the north and the Gaels in Ireland. And you can see the roads and cities that the Romans started to build. And then coming into this area where the Britons, the people that are now mostly we find in Wales, where the Britons lived, came a new group of people called Angles, Saxons and Jutes. And these people started arriving in the 5th century after the Romans had left. So after the Romans left, Britain was open to invasion from Europe, and you got these 3 Germanic peoples, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, beginning to take over the lands of the ancient Britons, leaving those who remained to be forced into a kind of slavery, while others would have moved further west into Wales or left Britain altogether and went into Europe. And that's the beginning, really, of what we call England, Angleland. Those people came to be known as Anglo-Saxons, and they spoke a language that's called Anglo-Saxon or Old English, whereas the earlier Anglo-Saxon settlers had arrived about 450 AD. Well, it took about 100 years before 7 distinct Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were established across England. You can see, if you look at the map of the distribution of people and the geography, you can see that the Celtic people were pushed into the remoter and more mountainous areas, whereas the flatter, better farmland, really, and closer to Europe areas, those areas remained in the control of the, or they came into the control of the Anglo-Saxon people. Okay, so basically the Angles, Saxons and Jutes got the best land, really. And then in 1066, the whole thing was thrown up in the air by the invasion of the Normans. And the Normans were French-speaking, the Anglo-Saxons had their own Germanic language, and over the years after 1066, for over the next few hundred years, the two languages started to grow together, so that by the time we get to the 16th century, we can't really identify the Normans as an ethnic or cultural identity. They've become mixed in. Something like this, with the Saxons and Normans speaking different languages at first. Okay, the Saxons speaking Old English and the Norman conquerors speaking Norman French. And then slowly the two languages merging together. During this transition period, we talk about Norman English and Anglo-Norman. Norman English would be the English spoken by the Anglo-Saxon people, influenced by the Norman French, and Anglo-Norman would be the language spoken by the Norman people, influenced by the English. So that for a period during the Middle Ages, the 11th, 12th, 13th, and even into the 14th centuries, you've got a sort of mixing of these two languages until finally they merge and basically become one language around about 1450, in the middle of the 15th century. So basically the Normans, their language has become mixed in, and both groups are speaking now something called early modern English, which is the English of Shakespeare. It's the English of the early translations of the Bible into English, and so on. So, what had happened during these Wars of the Roses? Firstly, the higher class elite, the nobility, had got weaker, and the merchant classes, the trading people, had got stronger. And also the feudal system, which was this system whereby the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon people, were living lives of more or less slavery under the Norman lords, that way of life, that social structure more or less came to an end. Also, at this time, there was a flowering of culture, especially going on in literature and music, on the heels of the Italian Renaissance and the new humanistic approach to life that was developing in Europe. And perhaps more than all of those, we've got the printing press. Gutenberg's printing press revolutionized communications all over Europe, and it marks a huge change, a huge difference in what was going on at that time. Here it is. This is what the early press would have looked like. This is a reconstruction. It was the means for publishing things like the Gutenberg Bible, which came out in the 1450s in Germany. It wasn't for another 20, 25 years or so that printed books started to be published in English. So we've got this new technology of the printing press. We've got Henry VII, a new king, a new age starting. First thing he wanted to do, this new king, was consolidate his power. And one of the ways he did that was by saying that he was king from the day before the battle in which he attacked Richard III. That meant that all of those who were on Richard's side were technically traitors. But he promised that as long as they promised that they would support Henry, then they wouldn't be punished. So it was a kind of a tactic for making his power strong right from the beginning. And what did he achieve? Well, he was good at trading, or getting trade agreements going. He was strict at collecting taxes. He was good at building up the economy. And he was against fighting wars with neighboring countries. So the country grew richer, and it was a relatively peaceful time. There was an alliance made with Scotland. through the marriage of Henry's daughter Margaret to James Stuart, and there was another marriage, an important marriage, with the Spanish princess and Henry's eldest son Arthur, as well as an alliance made with Germany at that time. These two marriages are of particular importance. We'll be coming back to them. So what happened? What was left behind when Henry died? It meant that his son Henry VIII, who was the surviving son after the death of Arthur, his son managed to lose all the wealth that his father had accumulated, and not only his personal wealth, but the country's wealth. The economy was greatly weakened because, unlike his father, Henry VIII got deeply involved in wars with other countries. And those two marriages, these very important marriages, the marriage to James IV of Scotland was really important because that meant that there was English blood in the Scottish royal family. And then 100 years later, when Queen Elizabeth died, the Queen of England died with no children, then the next in line to become King of England was the King of Scotland, so that in the early 17th century, England had a Scottish king. And the other marriage between Arthur and the Spanish princess Catherine is also important because Arthur actually died just a few months after marrying her, and she then went on to marry the second son in the family, Henry VIII. And their child, of course, also Mary, went on to become Queen of England. Okay, so that's about as much as I can manage in terms of background for you. I'd like now to move on into Henry VIII and the actual Reformation and England breaking away from the Catholic Church, England's break from Rome, and its path towards being a Protestant country. Catherine of Aragon, this Spanish princess, is really central to that story. If Henry VII's eldest son, Arthur, hadn't died at the age of 15, history might tell a very different story. But of course he did die, and so when Henry VII died, it was the second brother, Henry, who became heir to the throne. Now, Arthur married Catherine a few months before his death, and then she was kind of stuck. Her parents didn't seem to want her back in Spain. She wasn't particularly wanted in England, but plans were made for her to marry the second brother, Henry. There were lots of problems connected with that marriage. Part of the problem was a money problem. Her father was supposed to have paid money for her to marry the English Prince Arthur. That was the custom that the woman's family would pay in order to smooth the marriage. But after Arthur died, Ferdinand didn't really see why he should pay all of that money, and so that led to a little bit of a problem. And even so, there was an agreement made that Catherine and Henry would marry when they were old enough, or when Henry was old enough. He was 5 years younger than Catherine, so when he became 15, the plan was that he would then marry Catherine. Well, marrying your husband's brother was not usually allowed, and so firstly they had to ask the Pope if that was going to be permitted. Catherine said that the marriage had never been consummated. She'd never actually slept with Arthur. So really, according to church law, her marriage had never really happened. She'd never really been married to Arthur if the marriage wasn't consummated. And anyway, the Pope gave permission to allow the marriage with Henry to go ahead. But unfortunately, in the meantime, Catherine's mother died, and she didn't have a son, so the future of Catherine's family in Spain was in question. And so Henry VII, the father, was continuing to argue with her father, the two fathers arguing about should she pay the dowry, how much should be paid, and it seemed as if the marriage was not going to happen. But just at that point, Henry VII died, and a couple of months later, Catherine went ahead, and the marriage between Henry and Catherine took place. And she was, by all accounts, quite an unusual and particularly talented person. Henry told everybody that his father's dying wish was for the wedding to go ahead, but historians tend to think that Henry probably made that up, since his father had been against the marriage for several years and had been holding things back. So Henry probably knew that Catherine was a good catch for him, and she had shown her common sense in all sorts of ways. During the years between Arthur's death and her marriage to Henry, she bought jewellery in order to keep herself going economically. She'd shown a lot of common sense. She'd acted as an ambassador inside in England, an ambassador for Spain, the first woman to be an ambassador in Europe, and she'd also shown herself to be very much part of the humanistic philosophical development, the humanism that was sweeping across Europe at the time, with major figures like Erasmus and Thomas More, and the Spanish philosopher Juan Luis Vives, and she was very much part of that sort of philosophical circle. So she was a very accomplished, very intelligent woman from her period. The only real weakness, from Henry's point of view, a weakness was that she had a daughter, but she never gave Henry a son. And once it became clear that she wasn't going to have a son, she was past childbearing age, Henry lost interest in her. He desperately wanted a male heir. He didn't really think that a woman would be able to carry on after his death. He was wrong about that, but he thought he would have to have a son. And so he started looking for a way to end the relationship, to annul their relationship. By 1525, she was 40 years old, and so she clearly wasn't going to give Henry the son that he wanted. And at that time, he started an affair with Catherine's lady-in-waiting. The lady-in-waiting was a kind of high-class servant, and he began an affair with Mary, and a couple of years later, he fell in love with Mary's sister, Anne. Anne wouldn't become Henry's mistress, unlike her sister Mary. She insisted that it had to be marriage or nothing. So Henry now went ahead with trying to end the marriage with Catherine, saying that from the beginning she was his brother's widow, and that goes against the teaching in the Bible, so the dispensation to marry her should never have been granted. In the Bible it says, if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an impurity. He hath covered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless. So he tried to argue that his wife's inability to bear a male child was proof that the marriage was against God's will. That's really important, because that's the turning point, really, for England to start on the path towards being a Protestant country. The reason that England starts becoming a Protestant country after this is because the Pope would not agree with Henry. He wouldn't say that the marriage should end. He said that the verse, or that the marriage was invalid. He said that the verse in Leviticus, the biblical verse, was about a living brother. Once the brother's dead, that rule wouldn't apply. And of course, Catherine herself continued to insist that she'd never actually slept with Arthur. The marriage had never been consummated, and so she'd never actually been Henry's brother's wife. So there was kind of double argument there for saying, no, this marriage cannot be annulled. These people have been joined together in marriage, and according to the teaching of the Catholic Church, no divorce, no separation, no annulment was possible. So Henry decided to go his own way. Forgetting about the Catholic Church, he ordered things to proceed according to his own authority. And an English court declared that Henry's marriage with Catherine was null and void, not valid, in 1533. And even before that, he'd gone through a marriage ceremony with Anne, and that was allowed in law on again in May in 1533, whereupon the Pope, Clement VII, issued what was called a bull of excommunication, meaning that was kicking Henry out, expelling Henry from the Catholic Church. And then the year after that, Henry made a law called the Act of Supremacy, which said that he was the supreme head of the church in England. So you've got this whole question of his marriage with Catherine at the central point of an important process of separation from Rome, which began in 1529 and was completed in 1537. It took a number of years for all the different steps to kind of take place. So let's look in a little bit more detail at England's break with Rome. The disagreement with the Pope over the ending of the marriage to Catherine was also, as it happened, going on at the same time as a big debate in other parts of Europe about the church itself, the Church of Rome, the Catholic Church. Basically, a man called Martin Luther had kind of got things started by writing his 95 theses, 95 things which he criticized the church for, saying, in the Bible it says this, but the church is doing something different. And this started a big argument all across Europe with, in the end, several countries choosing to follow a different path away from the Catholic Church. And so the Protestant churches got started at this time. Well, Henry didn't agree with all this Protestant stuff. He didn't agree with Luther. He was absolutely on the side of the Catholic Church. He'd even been given the special title Fidei Defensor, the defender of the faith, for writing a book against Luther. So it's kind of ironic, really, that although he didn't agree with the Protestants, he was kicked out from the Catholic Church. And so he and his country started moving in a Protestant direction. And because he'd broken with Rome, Henry had to make a few compromises in the Protestant, in the direction of Protestant reform. The first compromise, the biggest one really, was allowing the Bible to be translated into English. I'd say they're both actually, this and the second one. Both of these compromises are very important. But the first compromise was allowing the Bible to be translated into English. Henry had burned an earlier Protestant reformer, William Tyndale, for publishing the Bible in English only 3 years earlier. Here he is, William Tyndale, being burned in 1536 for translating the Bible into English, and his dying words, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Well, 3 years later, it seemed that the King of England's eyes were opened, and the great Bible was published and ordered to be kept in every church. Largely, it followed Tyndale's translation, which needs to be seen as a very, very important contribution to the English language. we sometimes say no Tyndale, no Shakespeare, that Tyndale's translation kind of created the early modern English language in a standard form that Shakespeare then was able to build on. And the other big step being the dissolution of the monasteries, closing down those places where the monks and nuns had been working and living for hundreds of years, for 1,000 years. Over a 5-year period, they were all closed down. We can famously see that lamented in one of Shakespeare's sonnets, where he talks about bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. And Henry was probably very happy to close the monasteries, because all the lands and the possessions of the monasteries came into his possession, and he used a lot of those to get support of the kind of powerful elite to finance his foreign wars and so on. Some of the monks and nuns left England. A lot of them, most of them though, remained behind, and they were given some kind of pension, or it was possible for them to become members of the clergy. They were able to join the church as priests. They weren't allowed to marry, so even though they were no longer technically monks or nuns, they weren't allowed to marry until after Henry's death. And the buildings themselves were mostly either destroyed or just left in ruins. And here are a few pictures illustrating just the kind of impact that we can still see in the English countryside of the dissolution of the monasteries. Here, for example, is an abbey in Yorkshire. And there are Shakespeare's words, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang, showing his regret, really, at the closing of the monasteries. There's a lot of debate about whether Shakespeare may or may not have been a Catholic, and I'm not going to get into that debate. I tend to feel probably he wasn't a Catholic, at least not in the open sense. He certainly he went along to the new Protestant church and so on, but there are points where he seems to show a certain regret for some of what was lost at this time. Okay, here we can see some of those ruins. As I say, many of them in England, but some of them are other parts of Europe. And these are all still standing. And show us a culture, a society, or a level of society that has passed into history. And some more words of Shakespeare here from the play Henry VIII. Those that can pity here may, if they think it well, let forth a tear. Now, why would people feel regret? The monasteries, the monks and the nuns were not necessarily 100% popular, but they had performed a useful function over the medieval period. They were the main structures for providing welfare for the poor and giving ordinary people a chance of getting some education. And hospitals, kind of care for the sick, education for ordinary people, and welfare for the poor. These institutions of society suffered a setback that lasted right through until the 19th century. So there was some reason for regret. At the same time, many of the convents and monasteries had fallen into corrupt ways, and there was quite a lot of resentment against them, even before Henry led England away from the Church of Rome, and even before, he closed the monasteries and convents down. So there were mixed feelings. In conclusion then, basically, Henry's break with Rome was just the beginning of the English Reformation, and it was going to take a long time before the Church of England stabilized as a church that was separate from the Church of Rome. But we've seen today a very important step, two important steps in the direction of England becoming less of a medieval country and at the same time less of a Catholic country. The closing of the monasteries, the translation of the Bible into English were really, really important changes. So if we can carry those two things away today as a basic understanding of what was going on, setting England in the direction of becoming a little bit more like the country that we know today, those 2 points would be the basic points.